Two quick ways to know if you're being gaslighted.
Gaslighting.
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 People talk about gaslighting constantly, but very few can actually define it, distinguish it from normal conflict, or explain how it functions in a clinical context within the current dating and relationship landscape. I wanted to tackle this topic because for years, research on men experiencing gaslighting has been sparse. Today, I'm going to cover this topic clearly and precisely, and as we go, I want you to ask yourself these questions. Have you experienced gaslighting? What was that exact experience? What is gaslighting? What is not gaslighting? How can you recognize it in real time and respond accordingly? This is the first of a two-part series, and in this video, I'll define gaslighting, discuss the research landscape as it relates to men, and discuss it within modern dating and relationships. It's a grounded, research-informed framework. If it's meaningful to you, please do share it with somebody else, subscribe, and come back soon, because part 2 will focus on recognizing and responding, such as how gaslighting actually shows up in real time, how logical fallacies are used as tools within it, and precisely how to respond to it, again, in real time. This material comes directly from multiple chapters of my Rules of Engagement, and for some viewers, it may change how they understand past and current relationships to live and lead a more successful life.
It's time to all choose your timeline on the roller coaster of life.
So in a clinical context, gaslighting is a sustained form of psychological manipulation in which an individual deliberately causes another person to doubt their perception of reality, their memory, or even judgments in order to gain control or avoid responsibility. In mental health and clinical psychology contexts, gaslighting is defined by these core elements. First, we have intentional distortion of reality. That's where the gaslighter repeatedly denies facts, events, or statements that actually occurred. Next is erosion of self-trust. And here, the target begins to doubt their own perceptions, memory, and reasoning. And then there's power and control motives. The behavior is used to gain psychological dominance or to avoid accountability, as I mentioned. And then there's the patterned behavior. It's not a single disagreement or a lie, but a repeated, sustained tactic over time. Importantly, gaslighting is not simply disagreements, poor communication, defensiveness, or different perspectives. Clinically, it requires systematic invalidation that leads to measurable psychological effects such as confusion, anxiety, lowered self-esteem, dependence on the manipulator for so-called truth. It's important to understand that gaslighting is not a formal standalone diagnosis in the DSM-5-TR. That's the official clinical diagnosis manual. But it is widely recognized in clinical literature as a psychological abuse tactic. It's often discussed in relationship with narcissistic traits, coercive control, emotional abuse, and even intimate partner violence. And unfortunately, gaslighting is a very serious topic that's typically nonchalantly tossed around online when men express and enforce their boundaries. While there are a few instances in the research literature about men who experience gaslighting, this area has historically been unexplored due to prevailing gender stereotypes and social biases. Here's a brief understanding of the gaslighting literature and research landscape between the genders before diving into how published literature helps us contextualize this for men in dating and relationships. First, research prevalence across the genders. Gaslighting is not exclusive to any gender. Studies have shown that both men and women can be perpetrators and victims of gaslighting in intimate partner relationships. For instance, men who were emotionally abused by their female partners exhibited higher rates of chronic depression than the general population. Second, underreporting and social biases. Male victims of gaslighting often face public skepticism, leading to underreporting and lack of support. Here, research indicates that psychological abuse by women is frequently perceived as less serious than similar abuse by men, which contributes to a lack of recognition and support for men. Third, psychological impacts on men. Men subjected to gaslighting have reported to experience significant psychological distress, including depression, anxiety, and a diminished sense of self-worth. The manipulation can lead to confusion, self-doubt, and loss of confidence, all of which impact various aspects of their lives. And fourth, the need for inclusive research. There is a growing call within the academic community for more gender-inclusive research on issues related to gaslighting. However, I do not expect it to gain much ground soon, given that as few as 5% of therapists and clinical psychologists under the age of 30 are men, and our institutions of higher education have become much more hostile toward men since the early 2000s. So, recognizing that gaslighting can be perpetuated by individuals of any gender is critical for developing effective support systems and interventions for all victims. So, what does all of this mean, and how does it all play out for you? One of the fastest ways to lose your self-identity and your soul is to let someone else tell you who you are. Once you allow someone to define your emotions and experiences for you, to reframe your memories, or even to rewrite your boundaries by way of shame, guilt, or humility, you've given them the patent to your identity. In one of the earliest studies on men's experiences with abuse in dating relationships, researchers in 1998 indicated that gaslighting is not always malicious, but it is a habitual personality characteristic. Specifically, authors reported that abusers, including women, may not consciously plot control strategies, but that does not make their behavior any less destructive. Even unconsciously, they manipulate because it works. These abusers distort and shame because you let it slide, and they use guilt and shame because it neutralizes you. When that's the pattern, gaslighting is not just manipulation, it becomes an all-out dominance disguised as logic. When you're gaslit in a relationship, you're the detainee of someone who rewrites history every time you try to hold them accountable. And in the process, it rewrites your motives, it rebrands your boundaries as abuse, and it spins your words as a form of control. One week, you're the most thoughtful man she's ever met, and the next, she's holding you responsible for outcomes that you never agreed to control, while insisting that your failure to anticipate her reaction proves that you were never supportive of her in the first place. That's what it looks like. And it's often done so seamlessly that you'll actually start believing that maybe she has a point. You start thinking that maybe you are too harsh. Maybe your reactions are the problem. Maybe you're the unstable one. Research in 2007 laid more groundwork for understanding gaslighting not as miscommunication, but as strategic and sustained emotional manipulation that's designed to erode a person's self-trust. It doesn't always come through as screaming or outright accusations. In fact, most of the time, it comes through subtle disbelief. She may challenge your version of events, tell you what you really meant, or recast herself as the victim. And it's sneaky, so it's done calmly and often with a look of confusion or concern that makes you question whether you've become the one unhinged. And that's the hook. Gaslighting doesn't get its power from outright lies. It gets it from plausible deniability. That's why it's so important to recognize it in real time and set firm consequences so she understands that this is the last time you will discuss it. From research, we also learned that male victims of psychological abuse often experience significant emotional damage that goes unrecognized due to social stigma and gender roles. And that's because men are conditioned to be the strong ones and to absorb emotional blows without reaction. And gaslighters, especially those whose emotional manipulation has worked in the past, exploit that cultural narrative. You're told that you're the problem when you're upset. You're gaslighted into silence because standing up for yourself would make you look aggressive. More recently, research in 2019 shows that gaslighting thrives in relational dynamics in which one partner seizes control of the emotional narrative, an arena in which women are often most socially practiced and effective. You might bring up a specific moment of disrespect, and instead of accountability, you get a story about how you're overreacting. And suddenly you're apologizing for holding your values, not what you actually said. And if you're not careful, this becomes a pattern in which her interpretation is the only version that matters, and your reality is treated as a lie. The kicker is that gaslighting, according to that 2019 report, undermines masculine leadership by making you question your own emotional instincts. Every time you feel disrespected and she tells you that you're overreacting or outright wrong about your feelings, she's not just invalidating your experience, she's undermining your authority. And as a result, you get quieter, you get more careful, and more accommodating. Meanwhile, she may double down because you will not hold the line. Researchers have gone even further by showing that gaslighting becomes most potent in isolation. Once you're emotionally withdrawn, disconnected from your friends or family, when you're unsure of your instincts and walking on eggshells just to keep things calm, you've entered the final stage. The manipulation at this point has worked to a T. You've been psychologically declawed, and now you're just trying to keep the peace in a war that you did not even know existed. As I'll dive into in part 2 coming soon, the fix is to stop negotiating multiple versions of reality. If you experienced it, it's real. If you felt disrespected, it's valid. Remember that your masculine leadership does not seek validation. It sets boundaries and follows through. If she tells you that you're making things up or outright changes past events, and you know that that's not accurate, don't explain to her. Just act. Maybe that means walking away, creating physical distance, or even cutting her access off entirely. And don't wait for accountability, because these abusers have gotten away with their tactics for so long, they'll never be convinced that they're wrong. But what they can't argue with is a man who recognizes it and responds accordingly, especially one who's had enough and is already halfway out the door. So recognize gaslighting when it happens. Stop defending your memory. Stop apologizing for other people's discomfort. And let your masculine frame and your boundaries speak. If they still try to twist it, let them do it on their own. And I'll address exactly how to respond to issues such as gaslighting and logical fallacies that often accompany it coming up here in part 2. So let me know your experience. What's been your experience on the receiving end of gaslighting, and how did you respond? How did that response end up? What kind of outcomes did you get? So be sure to come back soon for that discussion, and I'll see you then.